This podcast is brought to you by Ocado Technology, a division of the Ocado Group that builds the software and systems powering Ocado.com, the world's largest online-only grocery retailer. We've been disrupting the grocery industry for over 15 years using the cloud, robotics, AI, and IoT. Find out more and check out career opportunities at infoq.link/Ocado.
Welcome to the InfoQ podcast. Today I'm joined by Daniel Bryant. Daniel is easily one of the most well-read, well-informed software professionals I know. It does not matter what conference I seem to go to these days, I tend to run into Daniel. Daniel is a past CTO. He's most often found in small groups discussing microservices and architectures. He's the passionate one. Today we focus precisely on that. In this podcast, Daniel takes us on a bit of a journey from monoliths to microservices. Along this journey, Daniel covers seminal topics like bounded context, when's the right time to begin to break up microservices, how to start, what to break off, and then once you began this journey, what's next. He discusses concepts like event storming, practices like observability and tracing, and much, much more. We wrap with Daniel briefly talking about one of his talks called The 7 Deadly Sins of Microservices. So if you're at a point where you're starting to see velocity impacted by things like engineering team size, or you just need to scale portions of the stack separately from each other, this podcast is for you. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy it. Daniel, welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Thanks, Wes. Yeah, good to be here.
I'm really excited to do this podcast with you. We've wanted to do it for a while. So most recently, you were a chief scientist at OpenCredo, but you've shifted your role just a bit in the last little bit. Can you tell us what your plans are for the future?
Yeah, so I'm still forming them, to be honest, but I'm doing a consulting CTO gig with Specto Labs, right, a company based in the UK, focusing around microservice testing, sort of products and training and consulting as well. Also doing a bit of freelance consulting in general, loving the writing. I write for InfoQ and a few other websites as well. So for the moment, I'm kind of keen to, get back to the core technical skills. I'm really quite looking forward to playing with a lot of super interesting tech flying around at the moment, IoT stuff, lots of very interesting languages. I think JavaScript's kind of, got a bit of a renaissance going on. So keen to play with this with an eye to helping businesses deliver value from it. I've always been about that, right from like a very sort of junior point in my career. I love software development. I love playing with the toys, but I get even more satisfaction when I can help others, play with the toys and deliver value, whatever that means for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking just before this podcast that you've been working with microservices for 5-6 years, even before we were calling them microservices. What was those first projects like back 4 or 5 years ago working with microservices?
Yeah, so I worked for a company called IAT, where I ended up being the CTO there. Instant Access Technologies, another startup based out of Old Street in London, proper hipster alley, there it is. We didn't want to do classic SOA. We knew we had a very well-defined set of context, if you call them, bounded context, as we're now calling it. But we knew we had a very well-defined set of context for the way the application was going to process data and deliver value to end users. It was basically a price comparison website. We didn't want to go heavy SOA because a few of us have been on, classic SOA projects, WSDLs, UDDI, all that kind of pain. But we didn't also want to go monolith because we knew there'd be shifting scaling requirements. We knew we had, a fair few developers crowded around the code base. And therefore, between us, there was, I think, 3 or 4 of us sort of architected it. And between us, we came up with this notion of, loosely coupled services. And we were going to be spitting JSON over the wire. We were going to be using status codes, HTTP status codes, rather than, trying to do something else clever. And it kind of went from there. And then literally sort of a year into the gig, we started seeing other people going, hey, microservices, doing this, doing that. We were like, that looks very similar to what we're doing.
Yeah, sure.
And then the rest is history. Yeah, like, when Adrian Cockcroft jumped on it and obviously Sam Newman and all the big names now, the history has been, written so. But that's how I got into it.
Yeah, so you talk about bounded context. I remember the days of designing those schemas, and it was that big model that was all the way across the entire enterprise, that top-down design.
Yeah.
So what do you see as, I guess, the differences between microservices today versus the service-oriented architectures of the past?
Yeah, so I'll start by talking about like the canonical domain model. That was always the classic you sort of alluded to there. Yeah. And I know companies I work with spent months and years trying to get that right sometimes. And I think it's very hard to model the real world in one way.
Right.
Every model is wrong. Some are useful, we say. So trying to fit the, whatever your business is into one model is super hard. And I think even though SOA, the sort of classic SOA, lent towards services, it was still very much a monolithic thinking in terms of domains and so forth. So microservices are a move away from that, I think. I'm really a big fan of Adrian Cockcroft's stuff. So, loosely coupled SOA with bounded contexts. Right. And this notion of, there's a lot of good things with service-oriented architecture, classic SOA. I think we're quick to say bad things about SOA, but there's a lot of good things about it. But we're taking concepts from domain-driven design about how we break up and how we model our domain and sort of applying them with classic SOA as well. So I think there is a very clear difference in terms of the loose coupling. Right. That's, between contexts and between services, the loose coupling, not relying on WSDLs and heavyweight contracts necessarily. Something I hear a lot people talk about is Postel's law. Be conservative in what you send, but liberal in what you accept. Right. Those kind of things. Whereas classic contract stuff was very much, a strict, almost like a legal contract. I give you this, you give me that. And there's benefits for that as well, but microservices is moving more towards the Postel's law approach.
So you just mentioned kind of the definition that Adrian Cockcroft uses for microservices, loosely coupled service-oriented architecture with bounded context. Let's break that down a bit. When you say loosely coupled, what exactly do you mean?
So for me, it's I remember back in the day learning about cohesion and coupling. That was one of the first things I took away. I think it was from Robert Martin's books actually, and clean code and various ones like that. For me, the loose coupling is around this notion of things can be interchanged. Right. I think that's what we're seeing in microservices. So in theory, or as the theory goes, you can swap out bits of your architecture, bits of your domain, shall we say. So the loose coupling is you're not designing stuff. Like with a monolith, often we end up with spaghetti code. Right. Everything kind of gets tied together. It's very easy, say, in a classic monolithic application to cheat across defined boundaries. So like in Java, we have interfaces, but it's often you can sneak around the back, say. If you're dealing with one code base, you can sneak around and access something you probably shouldn't be able to. And that creates coupling. As soon as you've done that, then it's a kind of broken Windows thing. Often other developers will start cheating in the same way. And after a few years of that, you can get very good productivity. But after a few years, everything does become a bit of a big ball of mud, as they say, right, or a spaghetti code. So loosely coupled in my mind is, it's about breaking things up, defining clear interfaces and enforcing those kind of boundaries with a well-defined interface.
Okay, makes sense. All right, then the next piece of that definition is bounded context, of course, and you've already hinted at it there, but can you expand a little bit on how you define that bounded context and how you scope?
Yes, I mean, the classic sort of definition comes from the domain-driven design world. Right. Eric Evans, Vaughan Vernon did some fantastic work with their classic books. So I'm very much, would recommend listeners have a look at this kind of stuff. The classic kind of DDD approach. In terms of scoping them, it's really tricky. It's one of the hardest parts, I think, of microservices, if I'm honest. It's the same regardless of whether you're doing microservices or a monolith. Scoping the boundaries of domain components within your application, because whatever you're coding, there's clearly domains. There might be as an example, I've done a lot of work recently with e-commerce stuff. There's always a user domain, there's always a checkout domain, and there's always a stock domain. And how you define what goes into each of those is genuinely really tricky. Right. The domain-driven design books were written before microservices, but they give you a lot of hints about how to scope those bounded contexts. Things like looking for a ubiquitous language, they call it, which is a kind of term which just says, are we speaking the same language in the context? I often notice, sort of split for context is when the business uses subtly different words, subtly different languages between the different parts of the code base. You might say a user here, but account over here. And they're kind of the same thing, like a user has an account, but you can split them. The business uses different logic, or different words when talking about the logic contained within each of those domains. One might be more focused on security, one's more focused on, what the representation of the user within this application, those kind of things. Getting the kind of Goldilocks service or the Goldilocks model of the just right service is genuinely something I've struggled with for many years, and I see it with all the clients I work with. It's really challenging, and one of the key things is don't be afraid of experimentation. A bit of upfront design, but no big upfront design, as they say. Bit of upfront design, and then kind of iterate as you go along, as you learn more about the domain.
Right. So, but let's talk about that, right? So you worked with some clients. What do you recommend to them to go through this exercise? And it's almost subject verb analysis of UML that comes to mind. But
Yeah.
how do you really get down and define the domain for each of these particular areas?
Yeah, so it definitely depends on whether the client is, say, building a new application. Perhaps they're a startup, they haven't got product market fit yet, versus a company with a legacy, as we call it, or a money-making application. So that's definitely something. And in some ways, I don't recommend microservices if you are starting off and don't have product market fit, because you don't actually know your domain. You don't actually know sort of what you're modeling in effect. So perhaps putting that aside for a second, if you've got an existing application or a suite of applications, how do you break those things up? And usually it's a combination of a couple of things. It's chatting to the business, depending on how your organization is organized, the structure, you might be able to see clear parts. Oh, that's the billing team over there. That's the account team. That's the stock team, that kind of thing. So those are good hints to kind of services there. Sometimes you don't see that at all. You just have organization where it's just, literally sort of sales, marketing, that kind of thing, very layered type organization. And then you have to dive into the code and look for kind of, like you were saying, look for kind of certain nouns you'll see popping up everywhere. Look for certain verbs on those nouns, those kind of things. That will often give you hints as where to start looking. If you can see, the classic we've already mentioned, user service or user-like service, I should say. Often you find things like users, they almost become cross-cutting concerns because the user touches every part of the application. But if you start going, as you're doing some sort of analysis on the code, maybe you are doing sort of the word clouds, for example, in terms of like nouns that show up in the code base. Adam Thornhill talks about a lot of these cool techniques. I'm a massive fan of Adam Thornhill. He did a great presentation at KubeCon London actually recently, and he talked about various tools to do analysis of code bases. So that can often provide like sort of the core information to start your detective work in terms of those things.
As you were talking, one of the things that was going through my mind was Conway's Law. At what point does the architecture dictate the design, or what point do you decide to start changing the architecture to dictate the model that you want?
I think it's a lot of things wrapped up there, Wes, if I'm honest, in there, in terms of the organizational design, organizational structure and design influences the architecture and vice versa. So you see a lot of people like James Lewis talking about the inverse Conway maneuver, where you actually structure your organization to force the code to be a certain way.
Sure.
So there's two ways you can do it, and that in itself is which one do you do? And often it's, when I've worked with clients, you look at, is the business a technology-led business or a business-led business, to excuse the bad phrasing for a moment. If they're a technology company, it's often easy to say, here's how you do your organizational structure, or often they're so flexible you don't really need to do that, and you look purely at the code level. And as the code base grows, as the business grows successfully, people will form around areas of the code, and that's your kind of cross-functional teams. But with a classic organization, with sort of a business focused organization, it can be quite tricky to do that. They're going to say, that they often, very stereotypical here, but they'll look at IT as a cost center.
Right.
So they'll be like, why should I structure the organization around IT? You're just providing us a service. And there it's often best to alter the technology first, in terms of, and demonstrate some provable wins if you can split the technology out, and try at the same time to prove the business case for, look, if you work as cross-functional teams, you can actually deliver value to customers much quicker. Yeah. You often have to work a lot more with the business if they are sort of very much a bottom line driven classic enterprise.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on it. I hadn't thought of it that way. You mentioned something earlier about how you don't necessarily recommend microservices for a company starting out or a greenfield type application. Can you expand on that just a bit?
Yeah, this one's a controversial topic. So I've seen some great stuff actually. Martin Fowler and Stefan Tilkov had a great discussion online, which if people can search online, they can find some very interesting thoughts around that. I think Martin was pretty much saying, don't do microservices first.
Right.
And Stefan was kind of arguing around those things. So, but we're seeing, just as a counter to those things, as in, I always enjoy hearing thought leaders talk about these things, but looking in the wild, I've actually seen a few clients who've tried microservices first and did get a bit stuck in terms of they didn't actually know what they were modeling. They didn't know their domain. But we are seeing successful companies. Classic again at KubeCon London was Monzo, a very innovative bank here in the UK, talking about how they built Go-based microservices to build a bank, which is like not an easy domain to work with. So, and I've worked, there's Starling, there's another bank in the UK. I did a hackathon a couple of weekends ago, and they've done, I believe it's Java microservices. So they did know their domain, probably first, because finance is quite a constrained domain to some degree, but they went all in on microservices. So the kind of stuff in the wild shows us it can be done. You can go microservices first, but most of the examples I've seen have been that they knew their domain very well up front. They might be a new business, but they understood the domain, they understood the models associated with that domain. And a lot of the domains I'm hearing about are financially driven. So finance is, it's kind of a very much a bounded universe, I think, from my experience of finance. So it's easier to model. Whereas if you're going, you're building some super innovative new product that's going to change kind of the world, because of that definition, you don't actually know what you're doing. You're literally, it's classic lean startup. You might put something out there, like good old MVP, minimum viable product, and you say, is anyone interested in this? And then it's yes. Is anyone going to pay me money for this? Is there a market for it? So as you're learning, as you're going along, the model forms itself, the domain forms itself, I should say. Right. So they're trying to go, you either go super granular with the services, and then you just get this glut of things which are super hard to operate because they're very granular, there's lots of them, or you're constantly rewriting boundaries. And in that case, you might as well be building a monolith, because it's much easier to rewrite boundaries in a monolith than it is microservices. Yeah. So those are kind of my thoughts on it. But, I think your mileage may vary. We're seeing both things in the wild.
Sure. That's an interesting discussion, Doug. Surely there's more, right? Because you've got companies that have been around for years that obviously know their domain well, but they're still building in monoliths. Etsy comes to mind, for example, in New York.
Yeah, good example.
So what else is at play? What else might, I guess, be a thing that you should look for that might be a smell that your monolith might want to break over into microservices?
I think some key things, it's generally two things I've seen in my client work. It's either that the technology doesn't scale.
Okay.
So, you're having to basically load balance across massive amounts of servers. You've got different areas of your architecture which should really be scaling independently, but you can't because they're a monolith. And the second one, which is equally as valid, not perhaps so much respected in when I initially chat with clients, is that you can't scale your dev team.
Right.
So you've got, like, the analogy is if you literally can see a monolithic rock, if we're all trying to chip away at this monolithic rock, and that's kind of analogous to us coding in the monolithic code base, you can only get so many people around that rock, so many people on the code base before you start hitting each other, tripping over each other, those kind of things.
Absolutely.
I did actually some work about 3 or so years ago now with a company called Not on the High Street here in the UK. It's kind of a UK version of Etsy, funny enough. And they initially contacted me and said, we're really struggling scaling our development efforts. So for me, that was quite interesting. And to actually get in there and see, the code base was pretty well architected. It was just a case of there was, some things that have gotten a bit coupled over the years, and they just needed a bit of help in kind of understanding where some boundaries would be brought in, and there were some clear bits which needed to scale very differently than other parts in the system.
Say you're in a monolith and you've established, so you start to kind of identify these boundaries through whatever process. How do you start to break off the pieces? How do you start to migrate from a monolith to a microservice? What do you recommend?
Common question, Wes. Yeah, and it is difficult because a lot of people out, when I approach me after I speak at conferences, every business, every organization is unique depending on how much the kind of skills you currently have, the tolerance to experimentation, things like that. But I strongly recommend starting small and then working your way up. So the classic, I took this from Groupon and a bunch of other companies that have talked about it publicly as well, is I'll look for something, in combination with the company I'm working with, I'll look for something that's small but adds value. So something within their business context. The classic is a user registration page or a newsletter sign-up page, something that clearly adds value to the business, but it's not business critical in that there's going to be a lot of pressure on us to get it right first time, those kind of things. And then literally break it out, and the key thing is make sure it's a complete break. Often you have to put what's called seams, and Michael Feathers talks a lot about putting seams, so some kind of API between the new bit you're breaking out and the existing code base. That in itself, you have to figure out where the seams are and put in code appropriately and make sure there's a contract between those two parts are now being split out. But the most important thing is getting the whole delivery process from soup to nuts, shall we say. So once you've got this service, you've managed to kind of identify the seam, you've pulled it out, you must build a supporting continuous delivery build pipeline. Because with microservices, there's going to be many more things than just one monolith. So we need to make sure we can rapidly deploy changes
Right.
to all these other things. And it'd be very easy to go into a code base and, a bit of a PowerPoint architect style thing. You could draw in all your dashes in the code base and go, here, this is clearly the user section. This is clearly the checkout service, these kind of things. But without the ability to rapidly get things into production and experiment, it's going to be really hard. So get that pipeline in, and then everything from the developer experience locally through to some QA. You need to engage with QA people, need to engage with InfoSec as much as you do the architects and so forth. Make sure whatever you do, get it into production, get it running alongside the existing app. And only then will you be in a good position to start, we've learned some lessons about how we break out the architecture, but I bet you've learned a bunch more lessons around the operational side, the developer experience, the InfoSec, all these kind of things. And that is where the real value is, in my experience, in traditional or enterprises.
Sure, absolutely. So let's keep walking the stack, right? So we have this monolith, and we identify some boundaries, we establish a seam, and we kind of pull out this particular piece. And that usually goes fairly easy, air quotes, fairly easily, on what happens. But then you start to add more complexity, right? You start to have to orchestrate these multiple services. You start dealing with asynchronous calls. You start dealing with a variety of other issues. So how do you, as you continue to evolve, what are the next steps of things that you need to pay attention to as you go from one service to 2 services to 10 services?
So one of the key things, Wes, and it's an overarching concern, is getting the platform right. So whatever you're doing, be it, again, monolith microservices, but definitely microservices, you are deploying onto some form of platform. Even if that's a bare metal, pretty much. Yeah, you've got some bare metal and you're chucking an OS on top and running, say, executables or whatever.
Sure.
So the platform becomes super important. I've noticed this. I've got away in a few companies. We've been working for various reasons. We couldn't change the current platform they had, bare metal. And when we were deploying 1, 2, 3 services, no big deal. You start getting to more than that. And then operationally, it's quite challenging how you orchestrate, how you schedule the various services. And then I started valuing, and the teams I was working with, together we started to learn and value what I'm now thinking as platform dependencies, things like service discovery, routing, fault tolerance, all those things. Because in effect, one thing constantly have to remind myself and other people as well is that microservices are effectively a distributed system.
Right.
Yeah, even if you're running them, all in one thing, you are one container, shall I say, you're breaking your application up. So there is an inherent sort of flexibility that comes with that, because we can now split things and scale things and work on them independently. But there's a bunch of properties we need because we are splitting things out, and they typically are operational concerns. How do we observe the new services, those things? So that, in my mind, is a super important step. When you go above those 3 services, you're going to definitely have to make sure you get the platform supporting the future services you're going to work on. Because by that point, you typically have a good feel for how you're going to build the services. You might be going just one language, you might be going polyglot, but often by, say, the 3rd service, you have a feel for the framework you need.
Right.
Some companies I worked with, we were using Java, for example. By a couple of services in, we developed a Maven archetype, which was like basically the nucleus of, or a kernel, you could argue, of a service. And I've worked with some other companies, JavaScript, Ruby. We got to the same kind of point. There's examples out in the wild, like Finagle is Twitter's one. Netflix had Carry On, which is kind of very similar to what you need there. But yeah, once you've got those frameworks for your microservices, it's all about the platform underneath them as well.
So you've decided that you're going to use something like Finagle. You've got a kind of CI/CD pipeline. You're able to commit code and get it out into a production environment in a reliable kind of way. So that implies the culture, the kind of DevOps mindset that you need to have as well. Now, when you start to spin up these extra services, what types of things do you need to consider as you start to bring all these things out into production?
So I'm guessing a key thing would be observability. Right? So I don't know if you're sort of heading in that direction. Observability has always been important, but now we've got multiple things in play, knowing not only are the individual things working correctly, but is the glue working between them? And most importantly, is the overall system doing what you're expecting? I mean, that's, again, whatever technology you're using, whatever architecture style you're using, ultimately it's delivering value to someone, and you need to ensure that value is being delivered. So I've done a lot of work in previous clients, putting in observability features into services. So we're talking not only tech stuff like, queue lengths and latency, that kind of stuff, but also business metrics. And they can be like a genuine game changer if you get them right as well.
Yeah. Can you give me an example when you say like a business metrics? Because identifying what that one most important thing is probably another one of the really critical steps when you're trying to figure out metrics. How do you identify some of the business metrics that you want to measure, for example?
Yeah, so there's a great book by Alistair Kroll, I think it is. He talks about lean metrics. So I took a lot of cues from that book. I think I've got it right. But yeah, one of those, that book was really useful for me. If we're looking purely at the business metrics, it's always connected to the value you're trying to deliver. Right. Typically, that can be raw money in terms of like, are we making money? Those kind of things. Sure. Often it's the happy path journeys in my experience. So if you're, again, e-commerce website, the happy paths are, can you search for products? Can you look at products? Can you add them to your basket? And can you check out?
Orders per second, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, exactly, those kind of things. If you can't check out, the business is losing money. So from looking at those critical happy paths, those user journeys, the metrics kind of spring out. You already mentioned, Wes, exactly, like orders per second, conversion in general. Are people suddenly dropping off at a stage in the pipeline there? That's a bit suspicious. Maybe we've accidentally broken the checkout. I've had that one in one project I worked on in the past. So I think in combination with doing some reading around some of the theory, like Alistair's book and so forth, and in combination with actually chatting to your business and going through the actual journeys, that is critical. There's a lot of work actually at the moment going on around event storming, which is very interesting. So it's another technique, much like context mapping in the DDD world, but event storming talks about identifying events within your business. Not technical events, but as in actual events, such as order dispatched, those kind of things, or order accepted. Often when you identify those things through something like event storming, the metrics again speak for themselves because you're literally tracking orders per second, those kind of things.
What about tracing, and how do you create an environment where that you can replicate the path through a system so that you can find bad things that are happening?
Yeah, so distributed tracing, super important. I only learned that one actually in my second go with microservices. So the aforementioned IAT one, we didn't do distributed tracing, but we had a bunch of problems which led us towards the end of that project to start thinking we should. And I actually moved on to a new role then. So I've used Zipkin a heck of a lot. Again, we're not on the high street. The sort of I must have been working with them about 3 years ago when Zipkin was just becoming popular and it's becoming sort of consumable by other developers. We started using that a lot. The key enabler for this, and it's an old technique, as many of them are, but the key enabler is correlation IDs. So you need some notion of passing a correlation ID throughout your stack. Any request comes in the front door, sort of the API gateway or some other point of ingress, and it gets assigned an ID, a correlation ID. And then you must propagate that ID down through the stack, like in a header or those. That's a typical way of doing it, in an HTTP header or putting it in a message metadata. So if you're using something like Rabbit or ActiveMQ, and then propagate those down through the stack, and then you can usually pull out all the data you need by mapping the correlation IDs together. So one request comes in, but it might get fanned out, a bunch of services handle it, those kind of things. And then you can not only say log with the correlation ID, so after the fact, you can look at all the logs and join them together and get an aggregated view of everything that happened. But you can use things like Zipkin to actually, in real time, sample requests going right the way through your application. And that correlation ID is the magic there that enables you to tie them all up.
Right. Makes total sense. So another question that I hear a lot about in the space of creating microservices in your kind of internal API. A lot of people are starting to use binary protocols to be able to kind of improve the performance between inter-service communication and not have that kind of JSON delay. What are you seeing, or what is your experience around kind of JSON versus like binary protocols for inter-service communication?
Yeah, we definitely fell into the JSON way, sort of REST and HTTP and JSON being the de facto kind of standard. I've seen that in many clients I've worked with. I like JSON in that it's very interoperable. That's the kind of cool thing. REST, for example, if you've got Python one end, Java the next, it works really well. I've even seen back in classical SOA days where SOAP didn't work across platforms.
Yeah, me too.
So I like, it was really quite painful, some of that stuff. So I like the idea of REST and JSON being easily consumable. But I totally agree with you. I reckon we waste countless energy cycles deserializing and serializing objects to JSON. And it's, that's one way to look at it. It's kind of a shame, but not only are we wasting energy, but we're spending money on that energy doing that sort of computation of serialization and deserialization. There is a bunch of other things I think you get with binary protocols in addition to that as well. I mean, clearly the performance is great. There's less cost from serializing and deserializing and less data going over the wire typically. But the cool thing with these kind of things like Thrift and Avro and gRPC is they are an interface definition language, an IDL.
Right.
So you can specify the contract. That's what you need to do in terms of sending data over the wire in binary format. You always need a very clear contract, a very clear specification. And that can actually add a lot of value in and of itself.
Absolutely, yeah.
As much as JSON and REST is super sort of taking advantage of, say, Postle's law again, you can literally send any amount of JSON you want at an endpoint, and the endpoint can just pick out exactly what it wants. So you might get 20 megs worth of data coming in, you can pick out 10K's worth of JSON, but you've still got to deserialize the whole thing. And in general, it can lead to very casual programming, shall I say, in terms of, well, just chuck me anything, I'll check you anything back. And yes, it's very flexible, but an IDL, you have to think more about the interaction between services. Think more about the types you're sending over the wire. Think more about the interactions. Are you streaming data? Very popular in the reactive space at the moment, kind of the ability to keep the channel open, stream data, apply back pressure, all that kind of good stuff. Whereas REST and JSON and that kind of technology is very much anchored around the request response kind of life cycle as well. So there's a bunch of things there, but I really see the value in binary protocols. I like gRPC in particular, and gRPC has been picked up by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation now, which I think is pretty awesome as well. So they're collecting together a bunch of very interesting technologies, and for me, having gRPC in the stack gives you a lot of advantages over REST and JSON.
So I've got a question. Let's connect those two, tracing gRPC and protobuf and the binary protocol going across. What's that experience like with something like Zipkin? Is it pretty natively well supported for you to be able to still do tracing with binary protocols?
So in terms of native supporting Wes, I'm not overly sure in that one, because obviously now you're looking into a binary protocol as opposed to looking into text going over the wire. So that's very different. But my experience comes with using something called Linkerd. And Linkerd is a JVM-based service mesh. And it's very popular at the moment. Linkerd has actually been brought into the CNCF as well, so it's being a sponsored project there. A couple of other technologies popping up in this space. IBM wrote one. There's Envoy, which I think was from Lyft at the moment. This notion of a service mesh basically addresses a lot of these issues of inter-service communication.
Right.
And observability is a key component of that. So I know Linkerd has support for Zipkin. So you can wire up all your gRPC stuff. It's all going over TLS as well, but it's still, you can still pull out the details into Zipkin from those gRPC-based communications.
Very nice. I want to switch gears just a bit. You did a talk, I did a few talks on the 7 deadly sins of microservices. And throughout there, you went through things like lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and price. A bunch of great ideas. So I wanted to talk just a bit about some of these things to kind of wrap up.
Yeah.
So lust, it's 7. These are again the 7 deadly sins of microservices. For lust, you using the latest and greatest tech. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, so the classic at the moment is I see people wanting to move to microservices. At the same time, there's a bunch of very cool technologies out there which are kind of supporting, and they have driven the success of microservices. I think that's unarguable in some ways. I'm thinking of things like containers, like Docker, Rocket, things like Kubernetes, Mesos, Amazon ECS, all those kind of things. So it's super tempting when you're embracing one thing, like an architectural style, like microservices, to embrace a lot of other technologies, because, hand and glove is the kind of mentality, yeah. But in my mind, they are very separate things. You can do architectures in implement architectures using many technologies, and you can use many different technologies to implement many different architectures as well. So what I was getting at with the deadly sin of lust is, and I totally suffer from this, I got to put my hand up and say,
sure, many
of us who are in the space, we love playing with technology. Yes, why we got into it partly. We love building things, and part of that, particularly in IT, is experimentation. In perhaps the actual real building world, a brick is a brick, with many years formulating how the brick should be and so forth. But we are nowhere near that in IT. The container is definitely not standardized yet. So one thing I've seen people get tempted at is getting lost in the technology details. And again, hands up, I've early on in my career, I've done this with, say, Java frameworks. I used to get a bit lost in Java frameworks back in the day. And now I kind of realize you can pull back, and there's often core principles and core things that can be delivered by technologies. But a lot of my examples in that lust sin is be very careful about when you make a choice to bring something into the stack. Be very careful about the operational overhead, the skills, gap between what you've currently got, and the key thing. And I've got a separate presentation that's available on YouTube, which people can search for as well. I did it for a CTO meetup in London. Is to evaluate technology correctly, and not only evaluate technology correct at a technical level, as in if I'm a developer, if I'm an architect, but if you're a CTO. Evaluating architecture is super important, and arguably something I experienced when I became a CTO a few years back. It's very hard because as a CTO, you've got a lot of business responsibilities. So you're often getting dragged into those, and you don't necessarily feel in a place to comment on the technology. You might be, perhaps not coding as much or coding at all sometimes, but you've got to have something in your tool belt, a bunch of skills as a CTO that says, this is how I know this is not just fancy technology coming in, it's actually going to deliver value. So if people go to my slideshow, they can see that talk. It's actually a very popular talk. It's one I put together quite quickly, but I suddenly realized this has got a lot of value, because as people move up to tech leads, to CTOs, how do you keep that how do you keep dialed in to making the correct choices at the appropriate level of the technologies?
That's an awesome skill to have. I'd love to hear any advice you have on that.
It's hard, Wes, yeah.
Well, Daniel, lots more here to talk about, and you can find the full presentation out online to be able to learn more about the 7 deadly sins, plus the 7 more deadly sins of microservices. Yeah. Well, I enjoyed chatting with you. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me.
Thanks a lot, Wes. Great fun.